The sun had barely risen over the city skyline when Steve Smith stepped out of his penthouse, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor of the lobby. He had always prided himself on being the first to arrive at the office, a habit that had served him well in his ascent to become one of the country's most successful real estate moguls. As he strode towards his waiting limousine, Steve's eyes narrowed at the sight of a disheveled figure huddled in the doorway of a nearby building. The man's ragged clothes and unkempt beard were an affront to the meticulously maintained facade of the upscale neighborhood. Steve had made it his personal mission to keep the area clean of such undesirables, often using his influence with local authorities to have them removed. The driver opened the car door, but Steve hesitated. A scowl formed on his face as he watched the homeless man fumble with a worn cardboard sign. Without a word, Steve changed course, his expensive suit a stark contrast to the grime-covered walls as he approached the vagrant. The homeless man looked up, his weathered face a map of hardship and despair. For a moment, something flickered in his eyes, a hint of recognition, perhaps, or a glimmer of hope. But Steve saw none of this. All he perceived was an obstacle to his vision of urban perfection, a blemish on his carefully curated world. Steve's voice cut through the morning air, sharp and cold. This is private property. You have no right to be here." The homeless man opened his mouth to speak, but Steve continued, his words laced with contempt. "People like you are a disgrace. You think you can just take up space wherever you want? Do you have any idea how much this property is worth?" As Steve berated the man, a small crowd began to gather. Among them was Julia, Steve's teenage daughter, who had decided to surprise her father by accompanying him to work that day. She stood frozen, her hand clutching her school bag, as she watched the scene unfold. Steve, oblivious to his daughter's presence, reached into his pocket and pulled out a thick wad of cash. With a cruel smirk, he began to tear the bills into tiny pieces, letting them fall like confetti around the homeless man. "There, now you have got what you came for. Pick it up if you want it so badly," Steve sneered, his voice dripping with disdain. The homeless man remained silent, his eyes fixed on the ground, shoulders slumped in defeat. The onlookers murmured, some averting their gaze, others watching with a mix of shock and morbid fascination. Julia felt her chest tighten, a wave of shame and horror washing over her. She had always known her father to be stern and demanding, but this display of cruelty was beyond anything she had witnessed before. In that moment, the image of her father as a respected businessman crumbled, replaced by something far more sinister. As Steve turned away, satisfied with his display of power, his eyes met Julia's. For a split second, surprise registered on his face, quickly replaced by his usual mask of cool indifference. Without acknowledging her, he strode back to his waiting car, leaving behind a scene of humiliation and scattered worthless paper. The limousine pulled away from the curb, carrying Steve towards another day of deals and acquisitions. But for Julia, rooted to the spot, the world had shifted. The girl who had woken up that morning, eager to spend time with her father, was gone. In her place stood a young woman confronted with the harsh reality of who her father truly was. As the crowd dispersed and the city began to stir to life, Julia remained, her eyes fixed on the homeless man who was now slowly, painfully gathering his meager belongings. In that moment, a seed was planted, a desire to right a wrong, to challenge the world her father had built. Little did she know that this seed would grow into a force that would shake the very foundations of her family and everything she had ever known. In the days following the incident, Julia found herself drawn back to the street corner where her father had humiliated the homeless man. She had begun to leave her house earlier, using the excuse of extracurricular activities to mask her true intentions. Each morning, she would place a carefully packed breakfast and a few bills in a discreet paper bag, leaving it where she had last seen the man. At first, Julia never lingered, too afraid of being caught. But as the days passed, her curiosity and sense of responsibility grew. One morning, she decided to wait, hidden in the shadow of a nearby building. It was then that she saw him, the homeless man her father had berated. He approached cautiously, his eyes darting around before he picked up the bag. As he opened it, Julia caught a glimpse of his face. There was something hauntingly familiar about his features, something she could not quite place. Meanwhile, in his opulent office overlooking the city, Steve Smith sat behind his imposing desk, his mind drifting to the past. He remembered the days when he had been nothing more than a low-level real estate agent, hungry for success and willing to do whatever it took to climb the ladder. Steve had grown up in a modest household, his father a factory worker who had instilled in him a strong work ethic. However, as Steve began to taste success, he had found his father's simple values increasingly stifling. He recalled the argument that had led to their estrangement, his father's disappointment in Steve's ruthless business tactics, his warnings about the cost of success at any price. "You are losing yourself, son," his father had said, his voice heavy with sadness. But Steve had been too blinded by ambition to listen. As the years passed, Steve had hardened himself against such sentiments. He had built his empire through a combination of shrewd deals and uncompromising tactics. Each successful venture, each acquired property, had been another brick in the wall he had built around his heart. The man who had once dreamed of providing a better life for his family had transformed into someone who measured worth solely in terms of profit and power. Back on the street, Julia had begun to engage in cautious conversation with the homeless man. She learned that his name was John and that he had once been a skilled carpenter. John spoke of a past filled with pride in his work and love for his family, but his eyes would cloud over when asked about how he had ended up on the streets. One morning, as John was recounting a story from his younger days, he mentioned a name that made Julia's heart skip a beat. It was the name of her grandfather, Steve's father, whom she had never met and about whom her father never spoke. "How do you know that name?" Julia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. John's eyes widened with sudden recognition, as if seeing Julia clearly for the first time. He opened his mouth to speak, but then shook his head, retreating into silence. Julia pressed him for more information, but John remained tight-lipped, suddenly wary and guarded. Hi, Mrs. Touching Stories here. Enjoying the story? Subscribe now, like and comment to catch all the upcoming emotions. As Julia walked home that day, her mind raced with questions. The familiar features she had noticed in John's face, the mention of her grandfather's name, her father's inexplicable cruelty towards this specific homeless man, it all began to form a picture that both intrigued and terrified her. She realized she was standing at the edge of a mystery that could unravel everything she thought she knew about her family. The girl who had once lived in blissful ignorance of her father's true nature now found herself keeper of a secret that threatened to shatter the carefully constructed facade of the Smith family. As the sun set over the city, casting long shadows across the streets, Julia made a decision. She would uncover the truth, no matter the cost. Little did she know that her quest for answers would lead her down a path that would forever alter the course of her life and the lives of those around her. The truth Julia had been seeking came to light on a rain-soaked afternoon. She had been visiting John more frequently, each conversation a delicate dance around the questions that burned within her. On this day, as the rain drummed against the awning under which they sat, John's resolve finally crumbled. "I am your grandfather," John said, his voice barely audible above the patter of raindrops. The words hung in the air, heavy with decades of unspoken history. Julia felt as if the ground had shifted beneath her feet. She stared at John, seeing him with new eyes, the familiar slope of his nose, the set of his jaw, all echoes of her father's features. As the shock subsided, a torrent of questions poured forth from her. John's story unfolded like a tragic novel. He spoke of his life as a skilled carpenter, of the pride he had taken in his work and in his family. His voice grew wistful as he recounted Steve's childhood. A bright, ambitious boy who had once looked up to his father with adoring eyes. But as Steve grew older, a rift had formed between them. John had valued honest work and craftsmanship, while Steve became seduced by the allure of quick wealth and status. Their arguments grew more frequent and bitter, culminating in a final, explosive confrontation. "I told him his ambition would be his downfall," John said, his eyes distant with memory. "I feared he would lose his soul in pursuit of wealth. The final break came when John discovered that Steve had been involved in a questionable land deal, one that would displace dozens of families. When confronted, Steve had been unapologetic, declaring that sentiment had no place in business. Heartbroken and disillusioned, John had walked away from his son and the life he had known. But life on his own had been harder than John had anticipated. A workplace injury left him unable to continue his carpentry, and without family support, he found himself spiraling into poverty. Too proud to seek help, he had eventually ended up on the streets, a shadow of his former self. As John's tale came to an end, Julia sat in stunned silence. The grandfather she had never known had been living on the streets, humiliated by his own son. The weight of this knowledge pressed down on her, suffocating in its intensity. In the days that followed, Julia grappled with an internal conflict that threatened to tear her apart. The truth she now possessed had the power to shatter her family's carefully constructed facade. She imagined the shock on her mother's face, the potential media frenzy, and the irreparable damage it could do to her father's reputation and business. Yet the thought of continuing to live with this secret felt equally unbearable. Every time she saw her father, every family dinner, every moment in their luxurious home now felt tainted by the knowledge of John's suffering. Julia found herself standing at a moral crossroads. Should she reveal the truth, potentially destroying her family but giving John a chance at redemption and care? Or should she keep the secret, protecting her family's status quo, but leaving her grandfather to suffer in silence? As she lay awake night after night, Julia realized that this decision would define not just her family's future, but her own character. She had seen the result of her father's choice to prioritize wealth and status over family and compassion. Now she faced a similar choice. The burden of knowledge weighed heavily on her young shoulders. Julia knew that whatever decision she made, nothing would ever be the same again. The comfortable ignorance of her childhood was gone, replaced by a harsh reality that demanded action. As the city lights flickered outside her window, Julia made her choice. With trembling hands, she reached for her phone, knowing that the words she was about to speak would set in motion a chain of events that would change everything. The question was, would it be for better or for worse? Sunday dinner at the Smith Mansion had always been an inviolable tradition. Theater of appearances where the family displayed their perfectly rehearsed harmony. On this night, however, the tension was palpable, like a stretched cord about to snap. Julia pushed the food around on her plate, her stomach a knot of anxiety. She watched her father, Steve, at the head of the table, gesturing animatedly as he discussed his latest real estate venture. Her mother, Helen, nodded mechanically, a plastic smile frozen on her face. Helen's comment about Julia's silence and the mention of her supposed piano lessons were the trigger. The truth the young girl had been carrying burst from her lips before she could contain it. The words came out in a torrent, revealing her morning visits to her grandfather and the true identity of the man Steve had humiliated on the street. The silence that followed was deafening. Steve's fork clinked against his plate, and Helen visibly paled. The atmosphere in the dining room changed instantly, charged with shock and disbelief. Steve's face contorted in a mixture of shock and fury. His initial denial quickly gave way to a storm of emotions as Julia persisted, sharing details only his long-lost father would know. The carefully constructed facade of their family life began to crumble before their eyes. Helen sat frozen, her eyes darting between her husband and daughter, as if watching a tennis match with potentially catastrophic consequences. The weight of long-buried secrets hung heavy in the air, suffocating any remnants of their previously cordial dinner. As Julia's revelations continued, Steve's demeanor shifted from disbelief to anger. His voice, usually controlled and authoritative, now trembled with a mix of rage and something deeper, perhaps fear or shame. He demanded explanations, his words laced with accusations of betrayal and deceit. Julia, emboldened by the truth she had uncovered, stood her ground. She spoke of her grandfather's struggles, his regrets, and his desire for reconciliation. With each word, the chasm between father and daughter widened, years of unspoken tensions bubbling to the surface. The dinner reached its climax as Steve, unable to contain his emotions any longer, abruptly stood up, his chair screeching against the polished floor. His final words, a mix of denial and anger, echoed through the room as he stormed out, leaving behind a shattered family dynamic. In the wake of his departure, Julia and Helen were left in stunned silence. The beautifully set table, with its fine china and crystal glasses, now seemed a mockery of their fractured family. Julia, tears welling in her eyes, realized the full impact of her revelations. The truth had come out, but at what cost? As the night settled around the mansion, the Smith family found themselves at a crossroads. The carefully maintained illusion of their perfect life had been irreparably shattered, leaving them to face the harsh realities they had long ignored. The path to healing, if it existed, would be long and fraught with challenges. The aftermath of the disastrous family dinner lingered like a heavy fog over the Smith mansion. Steve, seeking solitude, found himself in his study, a room that had once been his sanctuary of success. Now, it felt suffocating, the walls closing in as he grappled with the revelations that had shattered his carefully constructed world. As dawn broke, Steve stood before the large window, his reflection a ghostly image superimposed over the awakening city below. The irony wasn't lost on him. The man who had built an empire from nothing now faced the specter of his own forgotten origins. Memories long suppressed began to surface. Steve recalled his childhood, marked by his father's absence and his mother's struggle to make ends meet. The parallel between his father's disappearance and his own emotional absence in Julia's life struck him with painful clarity. He had become the very thing he had sworn to never be. Across the mansion, Julia lay awake in her room, torn between relief at unburdening her secret and guilt over the chaos she had unleashed. The weight of her actions pressed down on her, as heavy as the silence that now permeated their home. She realized that in her quest for truth and justice, she had irreversibly altered the dynamics of her family. As the morning progressed, Steve found himself drawn to old photo albums, hidden away in dusty corners of his study. Each image told a story of transformation, from a bright-eyed, hopeful young man to the hardened, successful businessman he had become. He saw now how each step towards success had been a step away from the values his mother had instilled in him. The parallels between his life and his father's became increasingly apparent. Both had left behind those they loved, one physically, the other emotionally. The realization that he had unconsciously followed in his father's footsteps, despite his best intentions, hit Steve like a physical blow. Meanwhile, Julia ventured out of her room, the house eerily quiet. She found her mother in the kitchen, a silent figure amidst the remnants of their fractured family life. The unspoken tension between them was palpable. Filled with questions, neither was ready to voice. As the day wore on, Steve wrestled with his pride and his newfound understanding. The empire he had built, once a source of immense pride, now seemed hollow in the face of his personal failures. He realized that in his relentless pursuit of success, he had lost sight of what truly mattered. Julia, grappling with the consequences of her actions, found herself drawn to the photos of her grandfather she had secretly taken. In his weathered face, she saw echoes of her father, the same determined set of the jaw, the same haunted look in the eyes. She began to understand the complex legacy she had inherited. As evening approached, the Smith family remained separated, each lost in their own thoughts. Steve, still in his study, faced the daunting task of reconciling his past with his present. Julia, in her room, contemplated the true meaning of family and forgiveness. And Helen, the silent witness to it all, waited in the living room, hoping for a resolution she wasn't sure was possible. The day of reckoning had come for the Smith family. The mirrors of their lives, once pristine and flattering, now lay shattered at their feet, reflecting fragmented truths they could no longer ignore. The path forward was unclear, but one thing was certain: nothing would ever be the same again. The Smith household had settled into an uneasy quiet in the days following the explosive dinner. Driven by a mix of guilt and determination, Julia decided it was time to take action, unable to bear the weight of the rift she had caused any longer. One early morning, Julia slipped out of the house, her destination clear. She found John, her grandfather, in his usual spot under the bridge, the old man's eyes lit up at her arrival, but quickly dimmed upon noticing her troubled expression. Julia, her voice trembling, confessed to revealing the truth to her family. John's weathered face creased with concern as he inquired about Steve's reaction. Julia's silence spoke volumes, causing John to sigh deeply, years of regret evident in the slump of his shoulders. Meanwhile, at the mansion, Steve paced in his study, a war raging within him. His pride demanded he maintain distance, protecting the life he had built. Hi, Mrs. Touching Stories here. Enjoying the story? Subscribe now, like and comment to catch all the upcoming emotions. Yet a growing sense of remorse gnawed at him, forcing him to confront harsh truths about himself and his past. Family photos drew his attention, particularly one featuring a younger, happier version of himself alongside John, whose broad smile strikingly resembled Julia's. As Steve grappled with his internal conflict, Julia passionately laid out her plan to John for reconciliation. Despite John's pessimism about rebuilding burned bridges, Julia's determination remained unshaken, insisting they had to try for the sake of the family. Back at the mansion, Steve finally mustered the courage to discuss the situation with Helen. In the kitchen, the weight of unspoken words hung heavy between them. Steve confessed his uncertainty about fixing the situation, his voice barely above a whisper. Helen's comforting touch on his hand suggested that perhaps the path forward began with forgiveness, not just for his father, but for himself as well. Their conversation was abruptly interrupted by Julia's frantic phone call. The news of John's collapse and hospitalization sent shockwaves through Steve, condensing his conflicted feelings into a singular, urgent need to act. As Steve and Helen rushed to the hospital, Julia sat in the sterile waiting room, clasping her grandfather's frail hand. The doctor's mentions of pneumonia and weakened immune system faded into background noise as Julia focused solely on John's labored breathing. Steve's arrival at the hospital created a moment where time seemed to stand still. His gaze shifted from Julia to the man in the hospital bed, momentarily seeing not the weathered homeless man, but the father he remembered from his childhood. John's whispered acknowledgement of his son carried the weight of years of separation and regret. Steve stood frozen, a tempest of emotions playing across his face as pride warred with concern and anger with love. Julia held her breath, silently praying for a miracle. Slowly, hesitantly, Steve approached the bed. His trembling hand reached out to touch his father's arm, the gesture speaking volumes in the absence of words. In that touch lay the first tentative thread of reconciliation. As machines beeped steadily in the background, the Smith family found themselves at a crossroads. The waters of their past remained turbulent, but in this moment of crisis, the first plank of a bridge had been laid. The road ahead promised to be challenging, with years of hurt to overcome, explanations to be given, and forgiveness to be earned. Yet as Steve stood by his father's bedside, flanked by Julia and Helen, a glimmer of hope emerged. In the sterile hospital room, surrounded by the harsh realities of life and death, the Smith family took their first tentative steps towards healing. Their journey would be long and fraught with challenges, but at least now they faced it together, united by the unspoken bond of family that had endured despite years of separation and misunderstanding. The rhythmic beeping of hospital machines had become a haunting backdrop to the Smith family's vigil. John's condition remained precarious, his frail form a stark reminder of the years lost to estrangement and misunderstanding. Julia rarely left her grandfather's side, her young face etched with worry and hope in equal measure. Steve found himself torn between two worlds. The hospital room, with its antiseptic smell and hushed voices, represented a past he had long tried to forget and a future he was afraid to embrace. In contrast, his sleek office downtown pulsed with the promise of a deal that could cement his legacy in the business world. The opportunity had appeared suddenly, a chance to acquire a struggling competitor at a fraction of its worth. It was the kind of deal that Steve had built his empire on, requiring his full attention and ruthless negotiation skills. The board meeting was scheduled for the same afternoon as John's critical medical evaluation. As the hour of decision approached, Steve paced the hospital corridor, his expensive shoes echoing against the linoleum floors. His phone buzzed incessantly with messages from his executive team, each one a reminder of the high stakes waiting for him in the boardroom. Julia watched her father's internal struggle with a mixture of frustration and sympathy. She had seen glimpses of change in him over the past few days, moments of tenderness and regret that hinted at the man he could be. But old habits died hard, and the allure of business success still held a powerful sway over Steve. The turning point came unexpectedly. As Steve stood by John's bedside, steeling himself to leave for the meeting, his father's eyes fluttered open. There was a moment of clarity in those aged eyes, a flash of recognition, and an unspoken plea that hit Steve like a physical blow. In that instant, the carefully constructed walls around Steve's heart began to crumble. Memories flooded back, fishing trips, bedtime stories, his father's booming laugh. He saw not just the man before him, but the father who had once been his whole world. The realization of what truly mattered washed over Steve like a tidal wave. The business deal, which had seemed so crucial mere moments ago, now felt hollow and meaningless in comparison to the precious, fleeting moments with his father. With trembling hands, Steve reached for his phone. His fingers hovered over the keys as he wrestled with the magnitude of his choice. Years of ambition and single-minded focus on success warred against the long-buried yearning for family and redemption. In the end, it wasn't a decision made with his head, but with his heart. Steve sent a brief message to his board, delegating the negotiation to his trusted second-in-command. The response was immediate, a flurry of concerned and angry messages that Steve silenced with a firm press of a button. As he set the phone aside, Steve felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He turned back to his father's bed, taking John's weathered hand in his own. Julia, witnessing this silent but profound moment, felt tears welling in her eyes. The afternoon passed in a blur of medical consultations and quiet conversations. Steve remained steadfast at his father's side, his presence a silent testament to his choice. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the hospital room, John's condition showed the first signs of improvement. In the soft glow of the fading day, Steve experienced an epiphany. Success, he realized, wasn't measured in deals closed or fortunes amassed. It was found in the connections we nurture, the love we give, and the legacy we leave in the hearts of others. As night fell, the Smith family remained united around John's bed. There was still a long road ahead, years of misunderstanding to unravel, wounds to heal, and trust to rebuild. But in choosing to be present, in prioritizing family over fortune, Steve had taken the first crucial step towards redemption. The business empire Steve had built might falter, but in that hospital room, surrounded by the family he had nearly lost, he found himself richer than he had ever been. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of change as Steve stood at the entrance of his family's sprawling estate. The manicured lawns and imposing facade, once symbols of his success, now seemed hollow compared to the warmth emanating from the modest cottage nestled at the far end of the property. 6 months had passed since that fateful day in the hospital. John's recovery had been slow but steady, mirroring the gradual rebuilding of the Smith family bonds. The cottage, hastily renovated to accommodate John's needs, had become the heart of their healing process. As Steve made his way down the winding path, he reflected on the transformation of the past months. The business deal he had sacrificed had indeed cost him. His company's stock had taken a hit, and whispers of his softening circulated in boardrooms. Yet, the weight of those losses seemed insignificant compared to the richness he had gained. Approaching the cottage, Steve paused to observe the scene through the window. Julia sat cross-legged on the floor, engrossed in a game of chess with John. Helen bustled about in the small kitchen, the aroma of her famous cinnamon rolls wafting through the air. The sight stirred something profound in Steve, a sense of belonging he had long forgotten. Inside, the cottage hummed with the quiet energy of family life. John's health had improved remarkably, his eyes now bright with life and mischief. Julia had blossomed, her relationship with her father and grandfather adding depth to her already compassionate nature. Helen moved about with a newfound lightness, as if the healing of the family had lifted a burden from her shoulders as well. Steve's entrance was met with warm smiles and affectionate gestures. Hi, Mrs. Touching Stories here. Enjoying the story? Subscribe now, like, and comment to catch all the upcoming emotions. As he settled into his usual spot on the worn leather armchair, he marveled at the ease with which he now fit into this tableau of domestic tranquility. The cutthroat businessman was still there, but tempered now by compassion and a broader perspective on what truly constituted success. The afternoon unfolded in a tapestry of small, precious moments: a shared laugh over a misplayed chess move, the comfortable silence as they savored Helen's baking, the gentle ribbing between father and son as they recalled shared memories, now viewed through a lens of understanding rather than resentment. As evening approached, the family migrated to the small porch overlooking the estate's gardens. The setting sun painted the sky in hues of orange and pink, a fitting backdrop for reflection. Steve found himself opening up, sharing stories of his early struggles and the fears that had driven him to prioritize wealth over relationships. John, in turn, spoke of his own regrets and the harsh lessons learned during his years on the streets. In the gathering twilight, Steve realized that true wealth wasn't measured in bank balances or business acquisitions. It was found in the strength of family bonds, in the ability to forgive and be forgiven, in the joy of shared moments both big and small. The Steve of 6 months ago would have scoffed at such sentimentality. But the man who sat on that porch, surrounded by the love of his family, understood that he had finally found the success that had eluded him all his life. As stars began to twinkle in the darkening sky, Julia suggested they make wishes. In that moment, as Steve looked at the faces of his loved ones, he realized he had nothing left to wish for. He had already received the greatest gift, a second chance to be the son, father, and man he was always meant to be. The night deepened, wrapping the Smith family in its velvet embrace. There would be challenges ahead, old habits to unlearn and new paths to forge. But as they sat together, united in ways they had never been before, Steve knew that whatever the future held, they would face it together. In the end, Steve understood that the price of redemption, the business deals forsaken, the pride swallowed, the vulnerabilities exposed, had been worth every penny. For in losing his old definition of success, he had gained something far more valuable: a family, a home, and a sense of purpose that no amount of money could ever buy. As they retreated inside, leaving the porch light on as a beacon in the night, Steve felt a profound sense of peace. He had finally come home, not just to a place, but to the people who mattered most. And in that homecoming, he had found